Numbers. It was spring. The ground still had traces of snow, and I was about to be married. My dress was pure white, and I had a golden crown. As I walked up the aisle, the crown got heavier and heavier, and the dress more and more difficult to walk in. I thought everyone would point at me, but no one noticed. Somehow I made it to the altar. The priest was very fat and kept getting fatter, like bubble gum you blow. Finally we came to the moment. "You may kiss the bride." My new husband turned to me, and here were a number of possibilities. Sometimes he was blind, sometimes a pig, sometimes my mother, sometimes the man from the post office, and once just a suit of clothes with nothing inside. I told my mother about it, and she said it was because I ate sardines for supper. The next night I ate sausages, but I still had the dream. There was a woman in our street who told us all she had married a pig. I asked her why she did it, and she said, "You never know until it's too late." Exactly. No doubt that woman had discovered in life what I had discovered in my dreams. She had unwittingly married a pig. I kept watch on him after that. It was hard to tell he was a pig. He was clever, but his eyes were close together, and his skin bright pink. I tried to imagine him without his clothes on. Horrid. Other men I knew weren't much better. The man who ran the post office was bald and shiny with hands too fat for the sweet jars. He called me Poppet, which my mother said was nice. He gave me sweets too, which was an improvement. One day he had a new sort. "Sweethearts for a sweetheart," he said and laughed. That day I had almost strangled my dog with rage, and had been dragged from the house by a desperate mother. Sweet I was not, but I was a little girl, ergo I was sweet, and here were sweets to prove it. I looked in the bag, yellow and pink and sky blue and orange, and all of them heart-shaped, and all of them said things like, "Maureen for Ken, Jack and Jill, true." On the way home I crunched at the Maureen for Kens. I was confused. Everyone always said you found the right man. My mother said it, which was confusing. My auntie said it, which was even more confusing. The man in the post office sold it on sweets. But there was the problem of the woman married to the pig, and the spotty boy who took girls down backs, and my dream. That afternoon I went to the library. I went the long way, so as to miss the couples. They made funny noises that sounded painful, and the girls were always squashed against the wall. In the library I felt better. Words you could trust and look at till you understood them. They couldn't change halfway through a sentence like people, so it was easier to spot a lie. I found a book of fairy tales, and read one called Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast. In this story, a beautiful young woman finds herself in the forfeit of a bad bargain made by her father. As a result, she has to marry an ugly beast, or dishonor her family forever. Because she is good, she obeys. On her wedding night, she gets into bed with the beast, and feeling pity that everything should be so ugly, gives it a little kiss. Immediately, the beast is transformed into a handsome young prince, and they both live happily ever after. I wondered if the woman married to a pig had read this story. She must have been awfully disappointed if she had. And what about my Uncle Bill? He was horrible and hairy, and looking at the picture, transformed princes aren't meant to be hairy at all. Slowly I closed the book. It was clear that I had stumbled on a terrible conspiracy. There are women in the world, there are men in the world, and there are beasts. What do you do if you marry a beast? Kissing them didn't always help. And beasts are crafty, they disguise themselves like you and I. Like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood. Why had no one told me? Did that mean no one else knew? Did that mean that all over the globe, in all innocence, women were marrying beasts? I reassured myself as best I could. The minister was a man, but he wore a skirt, so that made him special. There must be others. But were there, though? Nope. But were there enough? That was the worry. There were a lot of women, and most of them got married. if they couldn't marry each other, and I didn't think they could, because of having babies, some of them would inevitably have to marry beasts. My own family had done quite badly, I thought. If only there was some way of telling, then we could operate a ration system. It wasn't fair that a whole street should be full of beasts. That night, we had to go to my auntie's to play beetle. She was in the team at church and needed to practice. As she dealt the cards, I asked her, "Why are so many men really beasts?" She laughed. "You're far too young for that." My uncle had overheard. He came over to me and put his face close. "You wouldn't love us any other way," he said, and rubbed his spiky chin against my face. I hated him. "Leave off, Bill," my auntie pushed him away. "Don't worry, love," she soothed. "You'll get used to it. When I married, I laughed for a week, cried for a month, and settled down for life. It's different, that's all. They have their little ways." I looked at my uncle, who was now sunk in the pool's coupon. "You hurt me," I accused. "No, I didn't," he grinned. "It was just a bit of love." "That's what you always say," my auntie retorted. "Now shut up or go out." He slunk off. I half expected him to have a tale. She spread the cards. "There's time enough for you to get a boy." "I don't think I want one." "There's what we want," she said, putting down a jack, "and there's what we get. Remember that." Was she trying to tell me she knew about the beasts? I got very depressed and started putting the beetle legs on the wrong way round, and generally making a mess. Eventually my auntie stood up and sighed. "You might as well go home," she said. I went to fetch my mother, who was in the parlour listening to Johnny Cash. "Come on, we're finished." Slowly she put on her coat and picked up her little Bible, the travel-size one. We set off together down the street. "I've got to talk to you. Have you got time?" "Yes," she said. "Let's have an orange." Can you hear people in the kitchen? Sorry, I'm just gonna have to carry on. Yes, she said, "let's have an orange." I tried to explain my dream, and the beast theory, and how much I hated Uncle Bill. All the time my mother walked along humming, "What a friend we have in Jesus," and peeling me an orange. She stopped peeling, and I stopped talking about the same time. I had one last question. "Why did you marry my dad?" She looked at me closely. "Don't be silly." "I'm not being silly." "We had to have something for you, and besides, he's a good man, though I know he's not one to push himself. But don't you worry, you're dedicated to the Lord. I put you down for missionary school as soon as we got you. Remember Jane Eyre and St. John Rivers?" A faraway look came into her eye. I did remember, but what my mother didn't know was that I now knew she had rewritten the ending. Jane Eyre was her favourite non-Bible book, and she read it to me over and over again when I was very small. I couldn't read it, but I knew where the pages turned. Later, literate and curious, I decided to read it for myself, a sort of nostalgic pilgrimage. I found out, that dreadful day in the back corner of the library, that Jane doesn't marry St. John after all, that she goes back to Mr. Rochester. It was like the day I discovered my adoption papers while searching for a pack of playing cards. I have never since played cards, and I have never since read Jane Eyre. We continued our walk in silence. She thought I was satisfied, but I was wondering about her, and wondering where I would go to find out what I wanted to know. When it was wash day, I hid in the dustbin to hear what the women said. Nellie came out with her bit of rope and strung it up, nail to nail, across the back alley. She waved to Doreen, who was struggling up the hill with her shopping, offering her a cup of tea and a talk. Each Wednesday, Doreen queued up at the butcher's for the special offer mince. It always put her in a bad mood because she was a member of the Labour Party and believed in equal shares and equal rights. She started to tell Nellie about the woman in the front buying steak. Nellie shook her head, which was small and tufted, and said it had been hard for her too since Bert died. "But," spat Doreen, "he were dead 10 years before they laid him out." Then she offered Nellie a wine gum. Well, Well, I don't like to speak ill of the dead, said Nellie uneasily. You never know. Doreen snorted and squatted painfully on the back step. Her skirt was too tight, but she always pretended it had shrunk. What about speaking ill of the living? My Frank's up to no good. Nellie took a deep breath and another wine gum. She asked if it was the woman who served pie and peas in the pub. Doreen didn't know, but now that she thought of it, that would explain why he always smelled of gravy when he came home late. You should never have married him, scolded Nellie. I didn't know what he was when I married him, did I? And she told Nellie about the war, and how her dad had liked him, and how it seemed sensible. I should have guessed, though. What kind of a man comes round to court you and ends up drinking with your dad instead? I used to sit all done up playing... I used to sit all done up playing whilst his mother... And why? I used to sit all done up playing whist... all done up playing whist his mother and one of her friends. Did he not take you anywhere, then? Oh, yes, said Doreen. We used to go down the dog track every Saturday afternoon. The two of them sat in silence for a while, then Doreen went on. Course, the children helped. I ignored him for 15 years. Still, Nellie reassured her, you're not as bad as Hilda across the road. Her one drinks every penny, and she daren't go to the police. If mine touched me, I'd have him put away, said Doreen grimly. Would you? Doreen paused and scratched in the dirt with her shoe. Let's have a smoke, offered Nellie. And you tell me about Jane. Jane was Doreen's daughter, just turned 17 and very studious. If she don't get a boyfriend, folks will talk. She spends all her time at Susan's doing her homework, or so she tells me. Nellie thought that Jane might be seeing a boy on the quiet, pretending to be at Susan's. Doreen shook her head. She's there all right. I checked with Susan's mother. If they're not careful, folk will think they're like them two at the paper shop. I like them two, said Nellie firmly. And who's to say they do anything? Mrs. Ferguson across saw them getting a new bed, a double bed. Well, what does that prove? Me and Bert had one bed, but we did nothing in it. Doreen said that was Doreen said that was all very well, but two women were different. Different from what? I wondered from inside the dustbin. Well, your Jane can go to university and move away. She's clever. Frank won't put up with that. He wants grandchildren, and if I don't get him... Yippee! Frank won't put up with that. He wants grandchildren, and if I don't get a move on, there'll be no dinner for him, and he'll be back with pie and peas in the pub. I don't want to give him an excuse. She struggled to her feet as Nellie started to peg out the washing. When it was safe, I crept out of the dustbin, as confused as ever and covered in soot. It was a good thing I was destined to become a missionary. For some time after this, I put aside the problem of men and concentrated on reading the Bible. Eventually, I thought, I'll fall in love like everybody else. Then some years later, quite by mistake, I did. Side note. Oh, I'm excited! What's gonna happen? Okay. My mother said that we had... Fuck my life. My mother said that we had to go downtown. I'm not coming. Get that Mac on. I'm not coming, it's raining. I know, and I'm not going to get wet on my own. She threw that Mac at me and turned to the mirror to adjust her headscarf. I kicked the dog out of her box and tried to clip on her lead. No, what? Side note, why is she kicking the dog? Come on now. Okay. I kicked the dog out of her box and tried to clip on her lead. My mother spied me. Leave that thing, it'll only get trodden on. But leave it! And she grabbed her shopping bag in one hand and me in the other and dragged me off to the bus, complaining all the way about ingratitude. When we got on the bus, we saw May with Ida, one of the women who ran the forbidden paper shop, and played bowls for the local team. "Look out, it's Louie with the nipper," hailed May with pleasure. "No nipper now," said Ida. "She's 14, and if she's Side note, what the fuck is a nipper? Am I allowed to say that? Is that just a kid? No nipper now, said Ida. She's 14. If she's a day? What the fuck? She's 14 if she's a day. Have one of those Sorry, Sophie, I'm really trying. She's 14 if she's a day. What the fuck does that mean? Have one of these coconut macaroons. And she stuck out a crumpled bag. Thanks, said my mother, and took one. Art going downtown? Asked May. My mother nodded. Well, I tell you, there's nowt that's cheap if you want fruit. Only some muck from Spain. We're getting mints, said my mother, folding herself round her handbag. She didn't like talking about money. Well, I tell you, there's nowt, repeated May. I tell you what, though, she leaned forward, pinning my hair to the seat with her bosom. May? I gasped. Auntie May, snapped my mother. Let's meet up at Trickett's for a cup of Horlicks at 3 o'clock. She leaned back, pleased, letting free of my scalp. Look, Louis, that Charles molting. May poked my mother and waved the strands of my hair attached to her coat. They do that at that age, Ida butted in. It's nowt. The bus pulled into the boulevard. My mother always called it that because of her memories of Paris. May and Ida went off to the tripe stall, and my mother went to the newsagent's, only to find they had forgotten to save her Band of Hope review. I was foolish enough to ask if I could have a new Mac. That Mac'll outlast your father, was the retort. We went to the market next. My mother always got her mince cheap because the butcher had been her sweetheart once. She said he was a devil, but she still took the mince. While he was wrapping it up, I got my Mac caught on the meat hook and pulled the sleeve off. Mom! I wailed, waving at her. Besom! She cried, and she took out a roll of sellotape and started to wind it round my arm. At that moment we saw Mrs. Clifton, who gave singing lessons, and did her shopping at Marks and Spencer's. Side note, I worked there. Everything is very British in this. I hope you've spent enough time here to know these things. Obviously you know what Marks and Spencer's is, but other things as well. Okay. Is something the matter with Jeanette's arm? She inquired. It's just her sleeve, replied my mother, keeping her H's as best she could. Oh, but I think she needs a new one, don't you? My mother shifted her shopping bag. No, I don't, I piped up. I really like this one. She looked at me with distaste. Well, I do think. We're getting a new one this afternoon, said my mother firmly. Goodbye. She moved us away, leaving Mrs. Clifton alone beside the belly of pork. You're a disgrace, hissed my mother, as soon as she could. What would your granddad say? He's dead. That's not the point. Side note. My mum would say something like that. Anyway. He's dead. That's not the point. She's stuck up and I don't like her. You be quiet. She has a lovely home. Before I could protest any further, she pushed me inside a shop that sold oddments and seconds. They haven't got any, I said, peering about with some relief. Oh, yes, they have, answered my mother triumphantly. She was rummaging behind a pile of cardboard boxes that had surplus written on the side, like branded sheep. Try this one. I put it on. It was enormous. Look, it's got a hat with it. She thrust a shapeless piece of plastic towards the place she thought my head would be. Nope, my hand would be. Which way round does it go? I was feeling trapped. It'll keep you dry whichever way. I remembered a film I had seen called The Man in the Iron Mask. It's a bit big, I ventured. You can grow into it. But, Mum, we'll have it. But, Mum, it was bright pink. We walked in silence to the fish stall. I hated her. I looked at the shrimps. They were pink all over too. There was a woman next to me carrying a Battenberg cake. It had pink icing and little pink roses. I felt sick. Then somebody was sick. A small boy. His mother hit him. Serve him right, I thought meanly. Side note, I would think the same thing. Yeah, what? I wondered whether to drop my hat in it, but I knew she... That's horrible. I wondered whether to drop my hat in it, but I knew she'd make me wear it just the same. I felt miserable. When Keats felt miserable, he always put on a clean shirt. But he was a poet. I wouldn't have noticed Melanie if I hadn't gone round the other side of the stall to look at the aquarium. She was boning kippers on a small... Fuck you. Sorry. She was boning kippers on a big marble slab. She used a thin stained knife and threw the gut into a tin bucket. The clean fish she laid on grease-proof paper, and every fourth fish had a sprig of parsley. I'd like to do that, I said. She smiled and carried on. Do you like doing it? She still she said nothing. So I slid as discreetly as a person in a pink plastic Mac can to the other side of the tank. I couldn't see very well because of the hood over my eyes. Can I have some fish bait? I asked. She looked up, and I noticed her eyes were a lovely grey, like the cat next door. But I'm not supposed to have friends at work. But I'm not your friend, I pointed out rudely. No, but they'll think you are, she replied. Well, I might as well be then, I suggested. She stared at me a moment, then turned away. Get a move on, hastened my mother, suddenly appearing round the whelk tray. Can I have a new fish for my tank? We've hardly enough money to feed what we have got. Without another mouth. That damned dog costs enough. Only a small one? A fantail? I've said no. And she marched off towards Trickets. I felt wronged. If she had taught me to read like other children had been taught to read, I wouldn't have these obsessions. I'd be happy with a pet rabbit and the odd stick insect. I looked behind me, but Melanie had gone. When we went to Trickets, May and Ida were already there. Ida was doing her Pools coupon and eating raspberry ripple. Look out, it's them. She nudged May as we came in. My mother sank down. I'm finished. Get some Horlicks down, May shouted for the waitress, who put down her cigarette and sloped across. Her glasses were at a funny angle and stuck together with Band-Aid. What you done? Demanded May. You weren't like that just now. That Mona put her new delivery of beef burgers on them, she answered peevishly, easing herself against the wall. They freeze them just like bricks nowadays. She flicked a dishcloth over the table. Just like bricks. It's not natural. She wiped out the ashtray. Not that I think there's out wrong with fridge mind, but you can go too far. You can, agreed May. You can. I had that Mrs. Clifton in here this morning, the waitress went on. She's a right one, common as muck, but all fancy with it. My mother blushed. I said, Doreen, what you pay at Marks and Sparks, you get for half the price down here. Ida murmured her assent. But you know what she said back? May said she... Fuck me alive. May said she didn't, but she could guess. She said, posh as anything, I like to fill my freezer with things I know are good, Mrs. Grimsditch. Oh, she's a one, exclaimed May. Called you Mrs. Grimsditch, did she? What's wrong with Betty, then? Aye, put Ida. What's wrong with Betty? And they all started chorusing under their breath. My mother was getting desperate. Mrs. Grimsditch, she began. What's wrong with Betty? Glowered the waitress, turning round. My mother turned to Ida for some help, but Ida was busy with her coupon. Liverpool against the Rovers, she said to May. What do you reckon? Nout, said Betty, butting in. Now what do you want? I haven't got all day. They're all them glasses to wash. My mother was visibly distressed. People spit in them and all sorts. It's enough to turn your stomach. She looked at me. Do you want a Saturday job? My mother brightened up. Yes, she does. Well, it can start now, can't it, Betty? Ida spoke from behind her Pools coupon. Aye, said Betty. There's all them glasses. So I set to work, while my mother and Ida and May filled in the coupon, and drank Horlicks. I didn't mind the work, and there wasn't much spit in the glasses. Besides, it gave me time to think about the fish stall and Melanie. Week after week I went back there just to watch. Then one week she wasn't there anymore. There was nothing I could do but stare and stare at the whelks. Whelks are strange and comforting. They have no notion of community life and they breed very quietly. But they have a strong sense of personal dignity. Even lying face down in a tray of vinegar, there is something noble about a whelk, which cannot be said for everybody. Why do I feel like this? I wondered. Then, just as I was about to turn away and buy myself a baked potato for comfort, I saw Melanie walking round to the stall. I went straight up to her. She looked a bit surprised. "Hello, I thought you left." "I have left. I've got a job in the library now, just Saturday mornings." What could I say next? How could I make her stay? "Would you like a baked potato?" I offered wildly. She smiled and said she would, and we went to eat it on the bench outside Woolworths. I was very nervous, and the pigeons got most of mine. She talked about the weather and her mother, that she had no father. "I haven't either," I said, to make her feel better. "Well, not much." Then I had to explain about our church and my mother, and me being dedicated to the Lord. It sounded odd for a moment, but I knew that was because I felt nervous. I asked her if she went to church, and she said she did, but not a very lively one, so of course I invited her to ours the next day. "Melanie," I plucked up courage to ask at last, "why do you have such a funny name?" She blushed. "When I was born I looked like a melon." "Don't worry," I reassured her, "you don't anymore." The first time that Melanie came to our church was not a success. I'd forgotten that Pastor Finch was visiting on his regional tour. He arrived in an old Bedford van with the Terrified Damned painted on one side and the Heavenly Host painted on the other. On the back doors and the front bonnet he'd inscribed in green lettering, "Heaven or Hell, it's your choice." He was very proud of the bus, and told of the many miracles worked inside and out. Inside had 6 seats, so that the choir could travel with him, leaving enough room for musical instruments and a large first aid kit in case the demon combusted somebody. "What do you do about the flames?" we asked. "I use an extinguisher," he explained. We were very impressed. There was a collapsible cross that fitted across the back doors, and a very small sink so that the pastor could wash his hands after every operation. "Water is of the essence," he reminded us. "Just as Christ bade the swine leap into the sea." Side note, Dan is outside.
No, I haven't made any new friends.
Can you hear that? Water is of the essence, he reminded us. Just as Christ bade the swine leap into the sea, so I rinsed the demon under this tap. After we had all admired the bus for long enough, Pastor Finch led us back into the church and asked his choir to sing his latest composition. It came to me from the Lord, just as I left Sandbach motorway services. The song was called "You Don't Need Spirits When You've Got the Spirit." The first verse went like this. "Some men turn to whiskey, some women turn to gin, but there ain't no better rapture than drinking the Spirit in. Some men like their beer, others like their wine, but open your mouth to the Spirit if you want to feel fine." The choir sang this and the rest of the verses, 6 in all, and we had a sheet to join in the chorus, which was accompanied by Pastor Finch on the bongos. The chorus went like this. Not whiskey rye, not gin, and not... Oh my god. Not whiskey rye, not gin, and dry, not rum, and coke for me. Motherfucker, what the fuck? Let me try again. Not whiskey... Not whiskey rye, not gin, and dry, not rum and coke for me. Not brandy fizz, but a spiritual... but a spiritual whiz puts the fire in me. Fuck, that's hard. We had a wonderful time. Danny got out his guitar and picked up the chords. Then May started beating out that 12-bar on her tambourine. Before long, we were all in a long line, going clockwise round the church, singing the chorus over and over again. The Lord is working mightily, puffed Pastor Finch, smacking the bongos with his palms. Praise the Lord. Roy, don't tax yourself so, fussed Mrs. Finch, who was desperately trying to keep up on the piano. Somebody take those bongos off him. But nobody did, and it wasn't until Mrs. Rothwell fell over that we finally stopped. It was only then that I noticed that Melanie hadn't joined in. Now for the sermon, shouted Pastor Finch, and we all settled back to enjoy ourselves. He told us about the doings of his tour, how many souls had been saved, how many good souls, oppressed by the demon, had found peace once again. I'm not one to boast, he reminded us, but the Lord has given me a mighty gift. We murmured our agreement. Then we were shocked as he described the epidemic of demons, even now spreading through the northwest. Lancashire and Cheshire had been particularly blighted. Only the day before, he had cleansed a whole family in Cheadle Hulme. Not sure. That's just a place. Ridden they were. His eyes roamed to the hushed congregation. Yes, ridden. And do you know why? He took a step back. We didn't make a sound. Unnatural passions. A tremor shook the gathering. Not all of us were sure what he meant, but all of us knew it was dreadful. I glanced across at Melanie. She looked like she was going to be sick. Must be the spirit, I thought, and gave her hand a little squeeze. She jumped and stared at me. Yes, definitely the spirit. At the end of his very fine sermon, Pastor Finch made an appeal. He urged any sinner to raise their hand and ask for forgiveness there and then. We bowed our heads in prayer, squinting up now and again to see if it was working. Suddenly I felt a hand on mine. It was Melanie. I'm going to do it, she hissed, and pushed her arm into the air. Yes, I see your hand, acknowledged Pastor Finch. A ripple of joy ran through the church. There was no one else, so Melanie had plenty of attention at the end of the service. Not that she wanted it. I feel terrible, she confided. Don't worry, breezed Alice, who was passing by. It's homeopathic. Poor Melanie, she didn't understand any of them. She just knew she needed Jesus. Then she asked me to be her counselor, and I agreed to go round to her house every Monday while her mum was at the club where she worked. We left together, me on a cloud, and her with a handball. We left together, me on a cloud, and her with a handbag full of tracts on the gifts of the Spirit and advice for new converts. As we reached the town hall, Pastor Finch shot past us, his gospel radio full on, windows wide open, and on the top of the van, a flag flying triumphant. That's his salvation flag, I told Melanie. Whenever someone gets saved, he hoists it up. Let's get on the bus, she replied, a bit desperate. So each Monday after that, I went round to Melanie's and we read the Bible together, and usually spent half an hour in prayer. I was delighted. She was my friend, and I wasn't used to that, apart from Elsie. Somehow, this was different. I talked about her all the time at home, and my mother never responded. Then one day she bundled me into the kitchen and said we had to talk seriously. There's a boy at church I think you're keen on. What? I said, completely mystified. She meant Graham, a newish convert, who'd moved over to our town from Stockport. I was teaching him to play the guitar and trying to make him understand the importance of regular Bible study. It's time, she went on, very solemn, that I told you about Pierre and how I nearly came up to a bad end. Then she poured us both a cup of tea and opened a packet of Royal Scot. I was enthralled. It's not something I'm proud of, and I'll only say it once. My mother had been headstrong, and had got a job teaching in Paris, which was a very daring thing to do at the time. She had lived off the Rue Saint-Germain, eaten croissants, and lived a clean life. She wasn't with the Lord then, but she had high standards. Then, one sunny day, without warning, she had been walking towards the river when she met Pierre, or rather Pierre had jumped from his bicycle, offered her his onions, and named her the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Naturally, I was flattered. They exchanged addresses, and began to court one another. It was then that my mother experienced a feeling she had never known before, a fizzing and a buzzing and a certain giddiness, not only with Pierre, but anywhere at any time. Well, I thought it must be love. But this puzzled her because Pierre wasn't very clever, and didn't have much to say, except to exclaim how beautiful she was. Perhaps he was handsome? But no, looking in the magazines, she realized he wasn't that either. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Then, on a quiet night, after a quiet supper, Pierre had seized her and begged her to stay with him that night. The fizzing began, and as he clutched her to him, she felt sure she would never love another, and she would stay. Oh, what the fuck. The fizzing began, and as he clutched her to him, she felt sure she would never love another, and yes, she would stay, and after that, they would marry. Lord forgive me, but I did it. My mother stopped, overcome with emotion. I begged her to finish the story. Proffering the Royal Scots. The worst is still to come. I speculated on the worst, while she chewed her biscuit. Perhaps I wasn't a child of God at all, but the daughter of a Frenchman. A couple of days afterward, my mother had gone to see the doctor in a fit of guilty anxiety. She lay on the couch while the doctor prodded her stomach and chest, asking if she ever felt giddy or fizzy in the belly. My mother was coyly explained that she was in love, and that she often felt strange, but that wasn't the reason for her visit. "You may well be in love," said the doctor, "but you also have a stomach ulcer." Imagine my mother's horror. She had given away her all for an ailment. She took the tablets, followed the diet, and refused Pierre's entreaties to visit her. Needless to say, the next time they met, and again by chance, she felt nothing at all, and shortly fled the country to avoid him. "Then I began. "There was no issue," she said quickly. For a few moments we sat silent. Then, "So, just you take care. What you think is the heart might well be another organ." "It might, Mother, it might," I thought. She got up and told me to go and Side note, I got distracted because I farted by accident and it went in my mouth as I was reading. What the fuck? Anyway. "It might, Mother, it might," I thought. She got up and told me to go and find something to do. I decided to go and see Melanie, but just as I reached for the door, she called me back with a word of warning. "Don't let anyone touch you down there," and she pointed to somewhere at the level of her apron pocket. "No, Mother," I said meekly, and fled. When I reached Melanie's, it was getting dark. I had to cut through the churchyard to get there, and sometimes I'd steal her a bunch of flowers from the new graves. She was always pleased, but then I never told her where they came from. She asked me if I wanted to stay overnight because her mum was away and she didn't like being in the house on her own. I'd said I'd ring a neighbour, and after much trouble finally got an agreement from my mother, who had to be fetched from her lettuces. What? Let's ring a neighbour. Who had to be fetched from her lettuces. Right. We read the Bible as usual, and then told each other how glad we were that the Lord had brought us together. She stroked my head for a long time, and then we hugged, and it felt like drowning. Then I was frightened but couldn't stop. Oh my goodness. Then I was frightened but couldn't stop. There was something crawling in my belly. I had an octopus inside me. Side note, does that mean that she the octopus's fingers? Okay. Alright. Anyway. What a strange way. Interesting way to write that. Okay, anyway. And it was evening and it was morning, another day. After that we did everything together, and I stayed with her as often as I could. My mother seemed relieved that I was seeing less of Graham, and for a while made no mention of the amount of time I spent with Melanie. "Do you think this is an unnatural passion?" I asked her once. "Doesn't feel like it. According to Pastor Finch, that's awful." She must be right, I thought. Melanie and I had volunteered to set up the Harvest Festival banquet, and we worked hard in the church throughout the day. When everyone arrived and started to pass the potato pie, we stood on the balcony, looking down on them. Our family. It was safe. Here is a table set at feast, and the guests are arguing about the best recipe for goose. Now and again, a tremor shakes the chandelier, dropping tiny flakes of plaster into the sherbet. The guests look up more in interest than alarm. It's cold in here, very cold. The women suffer most, their shoulders bared and white like hard-boiled eggs. Outside, under the snow, the river lies embalmed. These are the elect, and in the hall an army sleeps on the straw. Side note, sometimes what the fuck is going on? I don't know. Maybe you understand. Okay. La la la. Outside a rush of torches. Laughter drifts into the hall. The elect have always been this way. Getting old, dying, starting again, not noticing. Father and son. It has always been this way. Nothing can intrude. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Outside, the rebels storm the Winter Palace.